I'm here to introduce Don Ledingham. We're really pleased to have him with us today. Don will be our keynote speaker today, as a keynote commentator on education in Scotland. He is the Executive Director of Services for people in East Lothian Council and also Director of Education and Children's Services in Mid Lothian Council. Extremely busy. And his particular research interest is the use of metaphor, which he has used to develop the idea of the 7 sides of educational leadership. He's written in the Times Educational Supplement in Scotland since 2007. And from August this year, Don will be joining the Drummond International, one of Scotland's most respected international leadership consultancies. He'll be the Director of Innovation Leadership. He's also about to establish and become the Chief Executive of the Scottish Leadership Trust that will promote values-based leadership in Scotland. Sounds very exciting. And Don's topic today will be stories are better measures of learning than outcomes. So Don.
Thanks very much. I think really I'm just going to have a blather, so I'm not going to use any slides, and just feel happy. I'm happy just to really have a conversation. So if we just take that, and we've got a fair chunk of time. So what I want to explore is the challenge some of the current methodologies and managerialist approach that permeates education. And I want to explore a concept towards the end of this talk around self-improving systems. And is it possible to create a self-improving system, or is improvement only possible when there's someone with a big stick standing over you? And it's really just to try and tease some of that out. So Anne contacted me following a piece that I wrote in the Times Educational Supplement. I do a monthly piece, which is really a great thing to do, actually, once a month, to sit down, try and commit something to paper. That really is trying to pull together some of the thoughts that I've maybe been considering, or issues that I've been working with over that period of time. As Fiona said, I'm currently on the board of directors in 2 councils, and that's interesting. And we're working with 2 different political groups and 2 different chief executives. But what it does do, it's a privileged position to identify some of the commonalities, the common features of the way in which councils work. And councils are bureaucracies, and really so many of our systems fall into that same trap. So what I was exploring in that initial article that Anne contacted me was around about every conversation, every time I listen to people, it's about outcomes, 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 and saying that's what we've got to do, and the outcomes for children and young people are the most important thing. And I actually want to challenge that a little bit, because if you just take that singular focus on the outcome, you lose the notion of the process, and process for me is about people. And so what I was looking at was trying to look at the notion of one of the most powerful things in education that's happened over the last few years, I think, in the teaching environment, has been assessment is for learning. Are you familiar with that phrase? In terms of formative assessment. And that's where, particularly in the primary school environment, it's probably used most, where young people are encouraged through the assessment process to reflect upon their own learning. And they're using that in terms of, we're using assessment to develop and enhance the learning process. And as a consequence of that, you would hope that the outcome, whether it be literacy or learning about geography, will improve. And it's really using that framework. And that, for me, when I've seen that done well in classrooms, and it's more difficult in the current roles that I've got, but I used to try and dedicate a day a week visiting classrooms. I thought that was really important in my role, to get out and to demonstrate to colleagues and use the role of leadership to say that this is the most important thing that we do. We're all, whoever we are as leaders, the teaching and learning process is the most important thing in terms of education. And let's engage with that and let's reflect upon that. And watching primary teachers particularly using assessment is for learning, formative assessment, and looking at the impact that it made on young people was transformative for me. So when I look at systems, if I look at the education system, is that a formative system? Have we got a system which is formative? If I look at a school or I look at a college, do I take a formative approach or do I take a summative approach? Do I look at what marks you're getting? So if go back to the primary environment, if I take a summative approach and when I'm looking at your interpretation work and you get 9 out of 10, that's fine, 9 out of 10. And you get 7 out of 10, so you're obviously much better than this lady. And well done, and you really need to buck up your ideas because you only got 7 out of 10. But what does it tell us about how well we're doing? What does it tell us about where my strengths are? What does it tell me about how I might improve? And yet when we often reflect upon what schools are doing, we actually look at the numbers. So we look at the information about the performance of young people. And we make a judgment about the effectiveness or quality of a school or a college or an education authority or a class teacher, very often based around the outcomes for young people. But what's it actually telling that person in terms of how they might improve their work? What's that actually telling us about a school? So within the article that Anne commented on, I wanted to explore what I described as opposed to assessment is for learning, is the concept of evaluation is for learning. We don't evaluate full stop for its own sake. We evaluate and we reflect upon our practice in order to learn. And for me, that's still a massive shift for people to get to. Because often self-evaluation and certainly within the school environment, how good is our school, and using that model is not necessarily, it seemed too much for me as a checklist in order to, do you evaluate the practice? Yes, I do. I go through these performance indicators, I gather this data, I make a judgment about my practice, but it doesn't complete the loop in terms of actually then having an impact upon people's performance. And that's, I think, that evaluation loop of really starting to reflect upon my practice or as a learner. And I think that notion of us all as leaders or teachers should be seen to be as learners. How do I actually engage in that? And when I reflect back to some of my previous lives, I was a secondary head teacher for a number of years. And before that, I was a principal teacher of a subject for 10 years. And do you know what? I didn't need anybody on my shoulder. I didn't need anybody pushing me on to improve the outcomes for young people. I was there, I came into the job to do that. I came into the job to actually really be the best possible teacher that I could be. When I moved into leadership, it was to try and focus on the teaching and learning process. There wasn't any other game in town. That's what it was about. And yet, I think so many people like myself who have been in those roles, been in leadership roles, when you start to you move up the ladder, something happens to us. Something happens to us that we no longer trust people round about us to the extent that we would trust ourselves. Well, I was okay, of course you didn't, you were fine, leave me in a classroom and I will reflect upon my practice, I'll carry out research, I'll try things out, I'll test them, I'll get things wrong and I'll improve my practice. I'll do that, because I'm hardwired to do that. And I think many in the education business actually are likewise, but something happens in the system that grinds people down, perhaps, that they're not as reflective as they might be. And I'll touch upon that as we go through in terms of talking about culture and the role of leadership in it. But coming back to this notion, there's the golden rule of reciprocity. It was Wikipedia, it's a fantastic thing. Because I don't have a religious bent, but who knows what Luke 6:13 is? Now, here's a test, and it looks like you're all going to fail. Right, Luke 6:13 is do unto others as you would have them do to you. So do unto others as you would have them do to you. And something happens in the education business where we forget about that. That we, when we become leaders, managers, when we get into that role, something happens in our brain that changes that. And why is that? Why do I suddenly need to be right on top of you, metaphorically, and testing and not trusting you? What is it about that system that does that? And it's an expectation. You know, you're on one side of the door. 1 minute you're not a boss, and you come in and all of a sudden you're a boss, and I can't see him at the back. I don't trust him. His attitude's wrong. It's funny how you can judge that straight away. but that notion of I'm going to come in as a leader, and I'm going to, we're going to really focus on outcomes, and I need to get the data, I need to get the numbers. We've established that you're struggling a bit in literacy, but no, right, you're a good teacher, great results, you're not. There's a problem here, okay? There's a problem in that faculty over there, they're not doing as well. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to look at this data, this is really rich data, and I'm actually going to we're going to have some challenging conversations. Quite challenging, because you're not doing well enough. I won't really say that quite as hard as that, but there'll be no mistake in terms of I'm uncomfortable with your performance, and I expect something to be done about it. And we will return next year, and we'll look at that data, and we'll see what you've been able to do about it. Won't we? You better believe it. And it's that notion of that, it's that expectation that by doing that, somehow I'm actually going to improve you. As opposed to saying, I actually believe that you want to actually fulfill your own vocation and drive and want to perform as best you possibly can. So my role as a leader is to try and enable that culture to be extant, to actually encourage you to reflect upon your practice, encourage you to work collaboratively, start to really test and try things. I don't have any with me, but it was a wee bit of a joke. I thought it was a wee bit of a joke for a while, but actually it's gone down a storm. I created a permission to innovate permit. It's a wee permit, and it said permission to innovate, and it had 5 things on it, and one of the basic ones was a permission to try things and to fail. That's one of the most important things a leader can do, is go and have a go. Just have a go, try something, and if you get it wrong, that's where learning comes. I'm actually a great believer, we learn far more from failure than we do from success, because we often don't know what made that successful. So one of the big things that we try and do within the authorities that I'm responsible for is what we describe to try and create space for innovation. And part of that space is about permission, part of that is about encouragement, and part of that is about collaborative work. Has anybody here come across the concept of pedagogy? Anybody heard of pedagogy? You're coming on, that's good. That's good. Pedagogy.
Trust me, sir.
That could change, however, that could change in the course of this morning. But pedagogy is a phenomenon. Pedagogy is an absolute phenomenon. PEDAGOO.org. It's a website created by teachers for teachers. And Pedagogy Friday, what do they do on a Friday? They post experiences online about an experience they've had in the week. It is a phenomenon, it's fantastic, and it's taken off around the world. And what you've got teachers starting to say, I taught a lesson on Tuesday with a group of 15-year-olds, and it was a disaster. And here's why. But here's what I'm going to do about that. And you've got other people saying, well, I tried this and it was a great success. And it's creating this environment that people are exploring their own practice. Now, there's nobody standing outside the door with a checklist and a list of performance indicators in relation to pedagogy. It's been generated by teachers for teachers. I'm particularly proud that a couple of teachers that are driving are from our own authority, and I would like to think that's part of the culture that we've tried to create in terms of looking, in terms of enabling that kind of thinking, that you don't need permission from the director or the head of service or your head teacher to go and do things. When we talk about distributed leadership, I'm not really that keen on that phrase, But the bottom line, it's about the culture that we develop. So what I want to try and do just now is to, talked about my work in terms of research, and as with probably many people, I got well down the road of doing a PhD and didn't fail. How many people have you spoken to like that? Yeah, I've started a PhD and didn't got too busy, but I had a transformational effect on me. And Douglas Weir, who was my supervisor from Strathclyde, Jordan Hill, his phrase stuck with me, that research is the coiling of the spring. I love that metaphor, and you'll find I love metaphors just in general, and the more mixed the better, to be quite honest. But the coiling of the spring of actually reflecting. And I was reflecting upon practice. I was doing a piece of research when I was an assistant head teacher and then a deputy head teacher about schools as learning organisations. And this is now about 20 years ago. And I was really interested in using metaphor. So rather than trying to capture what a school was like by using the traditional means of gathering data, I was interested in trying to find out how people describe schools using metaphor. And I'll never forget, I got a group of teachers in, and this teacher, when I said, well, how would you describe the school? And she, we should wait for a while. Right, I know how I would describe the school. It's a woman lying in bed, and a woman lying in bed with a blanket that isn't quite big enough. And every time she rolls over, another part of her body sticks out of the bed. And everybody around her, that's it, that's what the school's about. It tried really hard to include, but it would swing one way and it would exclude a whole bunch of people, and it would swing the other way. And it was just fantastic. And I worked with that person, and she's gifted, but that's how she looks at the world. So I over the last 15 years have been exploring the notion of leadership, particularly in terms of trying to create a culture which enables and empowers. And so I want to introduce you to what I have described as the 7 sides of educational leadership, which are fundamentally about trying to identify the behaviours, the leadership behaviours, that I think come together to enable people to conduct their business, and I think potentially can make your life better and more understandable. And I'll talk a little bit later about the other applications for it. But you might like to note these down, because I'm going to ask you to do a wee exercise. And
integrity, like professionalism.
it is, yes, it is, and it's believing. John Buchan has a great saying. John Buchan, who wrote 39 Steps. John Buchan's saying is, the task of leadership is not to put greatness into humanity, but to elicit it, for greatness is there already. And I think you can take that to professionalism. We can. It's very, very easy for bosses to go around a bunch of people and say, he's good, she's bad, he's good, she's good, he's bad, and just wipe them out, that they don't have that professional integrity. I actually think if you really scrape not far under the skin of most people, they want to do a really good job, but often the culture has prevented them, and over a period of years and a number of experiences that have happened, that actually breaks that down. But I think you've got to believe in the goodness of people, that they want, if given the right opportunity, they want to do it.
It's interesting that interview panels regularly appoint people to very senior roles who are skillful at dividing people into stars and skivers,
yes,
rather than
yes. I'd like to.
integrity.
I want to come on. I'm going to conclude actually talking about behavioural interviewing, and actually using that. So thanks for that cue for that. But the 7 sides of educational leadership then. Firstly, the notion of a sculptor. So a sculptor starts off with an idea, but the end product is not necessarily what they finish up with. So they are interacting with a medium. And as they go forwards, they're using their subjective judgment, they're reflecting upon what they're doing, and it becomes an iterative process. But ultimately, it's an act of creativity and imagination. So that's the sculptor. As I say, I'll go through them really quickly. The next one is the scientist. The scientist is being objective, it's looking at the data, it's reflecting upon what others have said. So what is the knowledge bank that we have in relation to this area? It's then about testing, it's then reflecting upon data, and it's into that, trying to look at that improvement cycle, so the whole the scientific method. The next metaphor is the builder. And the builder has a definitive view of what the end product is going to be. They also have a command in terms of timescales about how they're going to complete that task, the order in which they're going to do it in, the resources that they have available to them. They're not going to build a building that's going to run out of, unless you're watching Grand Designs, of course, until they run out of money halfway through. So the whole thing is planned. And if I was to say, I'll make some judgments about the system later on using the metaphor. So let's just go through the metaphors just now. So that's the builder. The next one is the gardener. The gardener, the key issue about being a gardener is deferred reward. The concept of deferred reward. You do something, you do not get an immediate return. If I plant my tatties in the spring, I'm not going to get them till the autumn. In fact, last year I don't get them at all. So hopefully this year's a bit better for my farmer pals. But the notion of one of the greatest things in that respect is when the abbeys were built in the Scottish borders, when the masons round about the 11th century built the abbeys, do you know what they did? They planted acorns beside the abbey. And why did they do that? They knew in 300 years' time that people would need beams to replace the roof. Talk about thinking forwards, and talk about sustainability, and thinking about planting things that I will never see the benefit of, but others will. So that notion of deferred reward. Then the notion of preparing the ground. Preparing the ground, and also considering what are the environmental conditions. This will grow well in this environment, and that won't. And again, if we think about our own world, we often take something from one environment and expect it to grow and be applicable in another environment, and that's not the case. We don't have that environmental awareness. So, and also the notion of weeding and taking things out, and the maintenance agenda within the gardener as well. The next metaphor is that of the parent. And the parent, for me, is underpinned around the transmission of values. It's about unconditional positive regard. If there's one thing I'm proudest of as a head of education and director, is that if you go in to speak to just about any teacher, I would hope, in East Lothian, and ask, what's the underpinning value in terms of classroom practice, they would, not all of them, because you know, but most would be saying unconditional positive regard. And the shorthand for that is, we do not give up on kids. We do not give up on kids. Unconditional positive regard. And I think parenthood is about that. So I've got 2 boys. It doesn't matter what they do, I'm never going to give up on them. But that transmission of values. And the other aspect, I think, about parenthood, not in a patronising way, is that notion of holding people's hands and at an appropriate time letting go. I wrote a poem for my brother when his first child was born, because one of the greatest joys of being a parent, I think, is holding your child's hands. And one of the saddest things is when they no longer want to hold your hand. But the poem very simply was, take your child by the hand and hold the future there. Keep them upright if you can. Release them if you dare. And parenthood is about that moment of letting go, but still being there, regardless of age, in terms of still being able to hold them by the hand when required. And that notion of parenthood and leadership, I think, is a fundamental and is often lost. So the next one is the conductor. And the conductor has the score in front of them. If you were an orchestra, I have the big picture. I know what the big picture is. I will share that big picture with you, but I also respect you as individuals have a particular expertise. You have an expertise that I do not have. But if I could, as the conductor, enable you to perform to the highest possible standard, then I'm doing my job for you, you're getting that satisfaction, and then that ensemble piece of what we then collectively create in terms of a high-level performance is really taken forward. And the final metaphor is that of the villager. And the villager is that notion of equals, is the notion of connection, of partnership, of give and take. of if you're struggling, I will help you. One of the greatest blessings I have is living in a farming community amongst sheep farmers, and believe me, what they've been through in the last 6 weeks is unbelievable. It really is. But it's the way in which you see them helping each other in times of difficulty. That's the real challenge. But also taking pride when others succeed, and that's not always the case in an educational environment as well. You praise one person and it's taken as a criticism of somebody else. So there's the 7 sides of educational leadership. No one is any more important than the other. No one is any more important than the other. But collectively, they provide 7 lenses through which you can look at behaviour. And what I'd like you to take a moment to think about, I'd like you to think of 3 people. I'd like you to take yourself. I'd like you to take a boss that you've got at the moment. And I'd like you to take one of your parents. And could you try and identify the top 3 metaphors that you think would capture if I was going to describe that person? So yourself, the top 3 that you're probably most comfortable with, that describe you. So yourself, your boss, whatever level you want to go for, and one of your parents.
This is a leadership role.
It's just describing them as individuals. It's, you know, if I was to do this, you know, I would probably say, if I was describing myself, the 3 I'm probably most comfortable with, and probably are probably round about the sculptor for me, the parent, and probably the villager. These, if I was, you know, that's probably me capturing that. But there's another 4 there that contribute. Right? Yeah. Could you share any of your analyses there?
Yeah, sure.
Scientist, parent, and a villager. Okay. Could you expand on a little bit more about that? Describe a little bit more about yourself using that.
Well, my training was in maths and computing.
Okay.
And I really know, I always think in terms of numbers and the difficulty. So
Right.
when we're doing the mindfulness, Lindsay was saying for 2 minutes,
Yeah.
and let that idea disappear. I immediately thought 120 up.
Right.
1 elephant, 2
Right.
elephants, 3.
Yeah.
So, you know, I can't help.
So you're comfortable in that numbers, definitive, objective environment.
And when I look at something, it's always
Okay.
in terms of scientific process.
Yeah. And then you said a parent.
Yeah, I don't actually have kids. but,
No. Right. That's really interesting, and that's good.
I hope that
Yeah.
some of my qualities and trying to nurture other people in
Yeah.
a positive regard.
Are you conscious of doing that? Is that a conscious thing or a natural thing?
I'd be big-headed, I think, so it's natural.
Yeah.
I think possibly some possibility for that.
Right. Yeah. And how about as a villager? You said yes.
The villager, yeah, you know, a bit about helping and also looking for the positive.
Yeah.
Again, hope, that's a trait.
What I want to try and tease out here is that our behaviours as leaders have and whoever we are has a fundamental impact upon people round about us, and it's starting to understand ourselves, and also just as we were saying here just now. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Colleen was just talking about your 3 different people, quite different in different respects. And we came back to talking about professional integrity. People who maybe worked in that environment for 20 years and seen one boss after another come with that mentality of go-getter and we're going to use the numbers and a managerialist approach. They are successful, perhaps they drive performance. We've got this problem faculty up the top, you're still not improving. I'm driving that, but every time it's just, you're not lifting the lid in terms of your potential, in terms of taking that forwards. And that's where I think starting to think as a leader about how you use the framework. Now, one of the joys is, as you know, I've got 2 sons, and my eldest boy is working with an investment bank. And do you know they've got their own financial Hippocratic oath? It's a phenomenal place. It's all about integrity, it's all about values, it's all about everything that you wouldn't think about investment banking is about. But what he said, you know, I've been playing around with this model for about 15 years, and he and I are going to write a book together about it, which is really hopefully going to come out next year. But Douglas, for that is his name, said, you know that stuff you're doing, Dad? Do you know that's a leadership decision framework? I said, is it? What's that? He said, well, and he gave me a book by a guy called Daniel Kahneman. And Daniel Kahneman well, here's a test. I didn't know who Daniel Kahneman was, but does anybody know who Daniel Kahneman is? You do? Pardon? Thinking Fast and Slow. Well, you're right. You're really ahead of the game, because that was a new one on me. He's a Nobel Prize winner in terms of economics. And my son's particular interest is in behavioural psychology. Behavioural finance. I didn't know this was a field of study that existed. And Anne and I were talking earlier. We live in our own wee professional worlds with our own little bits of knowledge, and we don't think sideways. And so what Douglas said to me was, yeah, Daniel Kahneman, behavioural psychology is about the psychology of investment. And you would think, I always thought, well, it would all be to do with the numbers. It's so much of it is herd mentality. You know, if people start selling stock, we better start selling. There must be something wrong with the herd mentality. But also, as Kahneman talks thinking fast, is about automatic behaviours, learned behaviours. If we think about when you're driving a car, you don't need to think about it. Most of it is automatic. It's just there. You've just done it. You just do it. And what he's saying is that so many leaders and managers just do, my premise in terms of leadership is that it's the same in terms of leaders and managers. We learn a particular form of behaviours. We almost don't think about them, we feel comfortable about them, and we behave in the manner that maybe you've just described and don't reflect upon other elements. What Kahneman said, if you know, in terms of economics, you need to slow your thinking down. You just need to start looking at it differently. And you need to start, and this was the kind of the connection point that Douglas had made, you need to start looking at a problem from a variety of perspectives. And so the notion of the 7 sides actually became something that it became something that it wasn't, because I was using it for a different purpose. But as a leadership decision framework, to start to look at yourself, and also to start to look at problems. So in terms of a problem that you might have, you can look at an issue and you could say, well, actually, in order to, so I'll give you an example. I'm currently, in fact, I was on the telly a couple of weeks ago. I've been shouted at, being told I was a disgrace. I was in a public meeting with 400 people because we're having a consultation around a school and a community hub, and we're looking at closing some community facilities and building them as part of a new school. We'd done the first stage of the consultation, which had been a traditional consultation exercise, and it just hadn't worked. We'd had professional consultants in. So I was charged by the chief executive taking it over, and I used the 7 sides to actually plan out the process. And the key part of it was starting to think much more around the notion of being a villager and about being a parent, getting out face to face, using the Gardner approach about really preparing the ground, and actually it's still a painful process and it's still difficult, but it's actually, whereas the traditional approach might have been to try and take a scientific or a builder approach of, here's the consultation process, we're just going to bang, 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 everything's done, and we tick the boxes and we'll get an outcome at the end. And it just has enabled me to think about delivering that in a different way. But you can think about your own behaviours. You can think about your own leadership culture that you have. And ultimately, I think that's what I'm really talking about here is what is the culture that we aspire to have in learning environments, in schools, in further education colleges, in universities, in local authorities. And that probably takes us on to self-improving systems. But before I do that, I'd like to pause a moment, and maybe if you could just have a blether, or to the person next to you, just have a few thoughts about anything that I've said there just now. Just tease that area a little before I continue. Maybe just any observations or questions, comments? Isn't that interesting? So you were actually commenting about him?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. That's incredible. Isn't that incredible? That's not bad odds, you know, if that were a bookie there, I would say. But it is interesting. But one of the things I think we need to start to do is to start to become much more comfortable about who we are. Who we are. I don't need to become somebody else. As you get, one of the great things about getting older, is that you start to know yourself and become comfortable with yourself. And I think that's something. And then it's about complementarity. And how often is that word used in any organisation? There is that. I once made a mistake. No, one of my huge, infinite number of mistakes is I spoke to a colleague when I was the head teacher about best practice, and he came to see me and said, "I've got a real problem with that." I said, what do you mean? Because you're a fantastic teacher. In fact, I would describe your practice as best practice. He said, no. How I perform and how I do my business suits me. But if you describe that as best practice, you're actually disempowering other people that might want to do it a different way. And it really stuck with me in terms of, yeah, we need to be careful about how we use language, but we also need to be reflective upon people's strengths and use those strengths really well. But then it's about starting to become, you know, taking your boss. What about creativity? I'm sure he, yes, could be creative. Again, just as that notion of that greatness exists, that people can be creative. I do believe that being innovative and being creative is just part of the human condition. It's just there. But some people have managed to squeeze it out. And so it's about how do we enable that? And how do we even enable our bosses to encourage, well, why don't we think about this a different way? So I'm exploring innovation, and I've kind of got three simple kind of views on it. The first part is to start to look differently at things. And so, you know, the 7 Sides provides those different perspectives. So look differently at particular issues. Secondly is make connections. So, you know, my son's example of Daniel Kahneman, making connections with other areas of knowledge and thinking beyond our own box can be incredibly helpful. And the last one is try, fail, and perfect. I mean, and I think, you know, part of what we need to be is encouraging people that failure is not major, massive failure, but try things, get it wrong, improve. And yet there's a real fear in the system of any notion of failure. And if you create that kind of system where scariness, you're scared, my God, if I try something, you know, if I try something really quite radical, I've done some reading about it, so I've done my research, I'd like to really try this in my classroom, and, you know, it goes belly up, somebody's going to shout at me, or maybe not even shout at me, but I know that the environment doesn't encourage that. And so what a wonderful example that leader could do is to, in front of staff, say, I've been trying something, and, you know, I've made a real dock of it. I've really got it wrong. That's incredibly empowering for people, instead of, I'm brilliant, and we've done this, and we've done that, and it actually cuts people out. So I think that notion of becoming comfortable with who we are, and that probably leads on to, you know, I'm taking a big career decision of giving up a regular cheque at the end of every month. I really should tell my wife about it. But Norman Drummond, who I'm going to work for, an incredible guy, asks 3 basic questions. You know, in terms of how good is your soul, if you want to, you know, and it's the notion of who are you, why are you living and working as you are, and what do you want to do with the rest of your life? I mean,
fundamental questions that actually, you know, people in staff rooms would be uncomfortable with. Because it's, you know, where's this on any kind of scale of performance? But ultimately, if you started to enable that kind of conversation and really starting to understand who we are, being comfortable with other people's strengths instead of trying to cover them up, and then all the baggage that comes out with people when they're scared of being true with others. For me, just what we could create. Now, before we get too carried away and look at you know, the impact that I probably had as a director and a head of service, I would actually say it's actually been minimal. It's not as fruitful as it might have been. But the bottom line is, I've not been prepared to compromise my principles in terms of taking that forwards. And that notion of legacy, just to kind of move towards an end here, I think the notion of leadership legacy. There's another article just recently in Test that I wrote about, following a conversation with someone. My father was a GP, and I was brought up above the practice for 12 years, which was a fantastic experience. And he passed away about 14 years ago, but I still meet people that talk about my dad and say just what an amazing man he was. But the greatest thing is when I meet doctors who say, I went to do 3 months with your father, and I was going to be a surgeon, or I was going to be a physician, I was going to do this, I was going to do that. And 3 months after working with your father, I said, I'm going to become a general practitioner. Leadership legacy isn't actually on what you're doing now or the organisation that you're in. Leadership legacy lives on in the people that you have contact with. And I think that's the really powerful message, I think, that we need to be thinking about, whether we're teachers or leaders or colleagues, is how do we actually support those round about us? And if you get that right, then I think things really just become incredibly dynamic. Yes?
Do you mind if I just ask, isn't the culture of, I'm talking further education here, particularly, doesn't that drive our leaders towards certain styles of leadership?
I think education has followed the managerialist approach and swallowed it wholeheartedly. You know, last night I was meeting with my new colleagues in a business, and it's all about high performance, it's all about standards, it's all about really, you know, raising the bar, but there's nobody outside looking in. It's because, you know, that desire to actually perform well. And so, you know, that really interests me, because the number of times people working, so I've got, I think, what was it, last count? Yeah, there's 2,500 teachers in East and Midlothian. And they will often say in head teaching, I couldn't do that. And they know, actually, if they came forwards, the kind of culture we try and create. So people build those comfort walls round about them and prevent them from actually having to test themselves, to move into uncomfortable territory. So it's an interesting phenomenon, but there is possibly a template that people have in mind as to the kind of leader that we need to drive. You know, think of the language that is used. We need to drive this organisation forwards, not lift this organisation. You know, that very language just tells you what it's going to be like. And I think that's the kind of culture change that I would hope we would aspire to. So, to conclude then, the self-improving system, I fundamentally believe that with the right conditions we can do that. That is not to say we should not be accountable to others. And I think the model that I was involved in terms of working with HMI, as they were then, in terms of the validated self-evaluation. So getting involved in evaluation and asking others to validate my judgment, but using quantitative and qualitative. But if there's going to be a balance, then we need to err more towards the qualitative. We need to tell the stories. We need to think of case studies. These are the powerful things. These are the things that touch people's hearts. Even the numbers people, my friend. Stories touch people. Thank you very much.